Hi everyone, Pam here from Creative Homescaping. This is going to be a little bit of a different video today. I wanted to come on and give a big thank you to our veterans of this country. I am either going to post this on actual Veterans Day, which is November 11th, or the day it's being observed, which is November 12th. I'm filming it in advance, so I'm not sure which one I'll post it on yet. And I wanted to come on because I have had several members of my family in the military. Fortunately, none of them were ever killed on duty. I'm very fortunate. I know there are many other families out there whose loved ones have been killed, but I wanted to just tell you a little bit about my family members that served in the military, and also thank all of those who are currently serving and those who are currently veterans of the military. So the first person I want to bring up is my grandfather. And as I mentioned in another video where I told some fun facts about myself, my grandfather and my grandmother on my mother's side of the family were both from Finland. They were older when they had my mother, and my mother was older when she had me. So my grandfather was actually born in the 1870s. He lived in a part of Finland that is now part of Russia, and when he was a young man, he was conscripted into the Russian military, and he became a sharpshooter in that military. But eventually, because of how things were in his country, he wanted to come to the United States, which he did. And he was over here. He had a number of different jobs, but he was primarily a musician. He was a band conductor, and he worked in Finnish communities doing that sort of work in this country. But when World War I came around and the US entered the war, my grandfather, who was, he was in his 30s, late 30s at the time. He wanted to do something to give back to this country that he had been so optimistic about coming to. So he actually enlisted in the army, and given his age, they decided not to send him into active duty, but they had him go into the military band and be one of the band conductors and also one of the musicians that played at events. And so he didn't see active duty, but he did play the cornet. He also could play the trumpet. And towards the end of the war, after the war was over, he actually had the opportunity to meet President Wilson. They were having a ceremony I believe it was to celebrate the end of the war, and he was playing a solo piece. There's a piece where there is a lost soldier, and he's separated from his regiment, and the way they do that with the piece is that the person playing the trumpet is off in a distance, away from the rest of the band. And my grandfather was playing that piece, and President Wilson wanted to meet the person who had played that solo piece, and so my grandfather got to meet him. And my grandfather is actually buried at the Presidio in San Francisco. And I did take my mother to visit there once before she had passed away, to see his grave, and my grandmother is buried beside him there. So although he didn't fight in the war, he was so proud of being a citizen of this country that he wanted to give back in a way that he could during World War I. And then the next person in my family who is a veteran is my oldest brother. He is 14 years older than I am, and when I was 4 years old, he went to go to the Air Force Academy, and he was a pilot. He was an F-16 pilot, and he stayed in their Air Force until he was eligible for retirement. He was in Desert Storm. He flew many missions during that, and fortunately he was safe. And anyway, as I said, he did go to the Air Force Academy, and I actually have his hat from when he was a cadet. And there is a story behind this. It's actually kind of a funny story. So when the cadets graduate from the Air Force Academy, they all throw their hats up in the air, and the children in the stand are often run down to the field and try to get one of the hats. Well, my brother, being the clever person he is, told me he was going to put a string on his hat so that he could retrieve it and get it for me. So I already knew this. So I wasn't going to run down to the field. But I was sitting in the stands with his future mother-in-law and his future sister-in-law, who was around the same age I was. I was 8, she was 9. And a friend of the mother's was there, and she started having heat stroke. So we had to go to the restroom. And it was a very hot day in Colorado Springs. It was, I think, over 100. And so we went to the restroom, and she was getting some water for her friend and trying to cool her down. And she told us to go back to the seats where we were. So the young other girl and I started to head back to our seats. Well, that was right when they were throwing the hats in the air as we started to head back to our seats. And this mob of people started going down the stairway towards the field, and we got caught up in it. We couldn't move out of our, get over to where the seats were because we were just being swept away by this crowd of people. So we ended up down near the railing of the stadium. Somebody lifted us over onto the field. Another cadet came over to the field, lifted us down onto the field, and now we were on the field separated from the rest of the group. So we were wandering around to see if we could find my brother. We couldn't find him anywhere. Fortunately, I had remembered that my family had said they were going to meet at the flagpole. So I went over with the other girl who was crying because she didn't know what to do, and I said, look, we can't find my brother, and we went back up to where our family had been sitting once we finally got able to do that, and they weren't there. And so I said, okay, let's go over to the flagpole. That's where they said they were going to meet. And so we went over there, and it seemed like we waited an eternity. I don't know how long it actually was, but we waited at the flagpole, and finally I saw one of my aunts coming up, and she said, look, there's Pam. So they found me, and they were all very happy. They'd actually seen the two of us wandering around down on the field and wondered how we got down there, because my family members were actually sitting away from where my sister-in-law's family was, but they thought because her sister was around my age, we would like to sit together. So anyway, I did get reunited with my family. My brother came up with his hat. While Colleen and I had been wandering around, another cadet had given us one of his gloves, which I kept. So then my brother asked me how I had gotten that glove. So I told him, so then he gave us each one of his gloves. So I have a couple of gloves. One's my brother's, and then I do have my brother's hat. And anyway, so that's a fun story. I have a couple other members of my family who are also veterans. I have a cousin who was in the Navy during Vietnam, and I have another cousin who was in the Air Force. The one who was in Vietnam was from my father's side of the family, and the one who was in the Air Force is on my mother's side of the family. And fortunately, I don't think he had to see any conflict, but I'm not positive on that. And then lastly, my husband's father was in the Army, so my husband had to travel around a lot as a child. I did too. My father was not in the military, but he worked for government contractors, so we both moved around a lot. But so those are the veterans that I have had in my life, and I just wanted to extend a big thank you to everybody both the veterans and their families who have dealt with people being deployed and putting their lives on the line for the sake of the country. So thank you everyone, and I hope you have a happy Veterans Day.